Thank you, Joe. This kind of conference, I think, is extraordinarily important because the way we advance science is to constantly be doing research, looking at research, and asking the question, is our diagnosis valid? Is our diagnosis reliable? And do we need to make changes? Do we need to make inclusions? I am absolutely honored to introduce Bill Bernett. Dr. Bernett has been spearheading the whole intellectual scientific discussion in the United States on the inclusion of parental alienation syndrome as a valid and reliable diagnosis, and I applaud him for making it essential that people think about it, that people learn about it, and then people make up their mind about it. Dr. Bernett and I are actually members of 4 different organizations together. He's a member of Apple. We're both fellows of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, where he's also the treasurer. We're both members of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, where he's an esteemed member of the section on psychiatry and behavioral science. I'm on the board of directors, and he's also a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, as am I. But Dr. Bernett is the chairman of a large international committee that has adopted the mission of adding parental alienation to the next edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And the DSM is the foundation of American psychiatry. When the first DSM was created, it was an attempt to start standardizing the diagnoses. The DSM-2, well, around 1968, attempted to refine that. DSM-3 was the first one that actually included criteria, and it came out of the Research Diagnostic Criteria from the National Institutes of Mental Health. We now have DSM-4-TR, and we're getting ready to go on DSM-5, and it's an attempt to have reliability and validity. And many of our diagnoses are actually more reliable and more valid than many diagnoses in internal medicine. Dr. Bernett also wants to have the diagnoses included in ICD-11, which is published by the World Health Organization. And 1 month ago, Dr. Bernett and some of his colleagues published Parental Alienation, DSM-5, and ICD-11, and I have a copy here. I really recommend it to you. It's invaluable reading for any of us who work in child custody cases, and I highly recommend it. Dr. Bernett is a graduate of Harvard Medical School. I went to Yale, so I don't hold that against him. He is currently professor of psychiatry at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. He is board certified in general psychiatry. He is board certified in child psychiatry, and he is board certified in forensic psychiatry, all by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. As an expert in forensic psychiatry, Dr. Bernett has acquired a number of frequent flyer miles, as he has testified in over 16 states. He has written professional articles and chapters on a variety of subjects: group and individual therapy, humor in psychotherapy. He is a very amusing person to be with. So if you have a chance to have lunch or dinner with him, I highly recommend it. Forensic child psychiatry, child maltreatment, true and false allegations of abuse, satanic ritual abuse, child custody and visitation, parental alienation, and giving testimony regarding behavioral genomics. He also has written on risk management. In 2007, Dr. Bernett and the Honorable Don Ash, a judge, published the book called Children of Divorce, A Practical Guide for Parents, Therapists, Attorneys, and judges. I've been a child and adolescent forensic psychiatrist now for 30 years. I still learn things when I listen to Bill do presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Bernett.
Thank you all very much for being here this morning. And I'm glad we've now gotten through 3 introductions. The first one, the second one, and now Dr. Billett, the third one, which I appreciate very much. But now we can get to the actual presentation, so that's kind of cool. As you know, today and tomorrow we're going to be talking about a number of different aspects of parental alienation, many, many different aspects from different points of view. And I'm going to be talking about my own little niche. In other words, my own thing, my own little piece of this huge topic is parental alienation and whether it should be a diagnosis in the next Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is going to be called DSM-5. And obviously there are many, many parts of this big, big topic of parental alienation that I'm not even an expert in or familiar with, and I'm not talking about. But I am going to tell you about our effort to get this condition, this mental condition, accepted as an official diagnosis. Now, I'll tell you what I have to do is whenever I have a discussion about this topic, we have to have a little preliminary discussion about what we even mean by parental alienation, because there are a number of different definitions for this term, and you can immediately get into confusion if you try to have a conversation, or even more if you try to have a debate about parental alienation. So let me give you the definition that we use in the proposal regarding DSM-5 and ICD-11. Some of these things that are on the PowerPoint, I realize that you all know how to read, but I'm actually going to, some of them I'm going to read because this is being videotaped, and so we want whoever watches the videotape to know what it is we're talking about. So but this is so fundamental. Let's go through this. A child, usually one whose parents are engaged in a high conflict divorce, allies himself strongly with one parent, which we call the preferred parent, and rejects a relationship with the other parent, whom we call the alienated parent, without legitimate justification. Now, there's a couple of things to point out. First of all, the phrase high conflict divorce, that's the context that this usually takes place in, but not necessarily. That it's possible to have parental alienation, as we define it, in an intact family. It's not so common, but it's possible. Another phrase that just to pay attention to is that we use the phrase here, up here, the preferred parent, that we don't refer to this as the alienating parent. Some people who talk about parental alienation say that there always has to be an alienating parent who causes this problem to happen. And I agree that a lot of times it is the case, but we take the position in our proposal that parental alienation might be brought about by an alienating parent, or conceivably simply by the circumstances of the high conflict divorce. In other words, if you have two parents who are totally arguing and fighting over many, many things, including the child, even without active indoctrination going on, it might happen that the child gravitates to one parent and shuns the other one. And finally, a really important concept is that it's without legitimate justification, which of course means that we realize that there is a difference between alienation and estrangement. And these terms are generally accepted by people who study in this field. Alienation is the rejection of a loving parent without good reason. Estrangement is the rejection of an unpleasant or abusive parent, and so it's with reason. And just to be real clear about what we're trying to do as far as the diagnosis goes, we consider it a mental abnormality or mental condition to totally reject a parent who's a nice person, especially if that rejection is founded on a false belief. In other words, it's almost like a delusion that the child believes that the other parent is evil or dangerous. The parent really isn't, and so the child loses that relationship. That's what we consider a mental disorder. If a child wants to reject a parent who's abusive, that's not a mental disorder. That sounds kind of normal to me, for a child to not want to go visit a person who's abusive. So I just want to get all the terms straight, and I think we're on the right track. So for those of you who are interested in family systems, this is another way to think about it. Of course, this is a diagram in which there's conflict between the preferred parent and the alienated parent. Frequently between the preferred parent and the child, there's an enmeshed relationship. And see this little wiggle here? This little wiggle here is what we're referring to as the parental alienation. In other words, it's the phenomenon in the child that the child is rejecting this alienated parent and has an enmeshed relationship with this one. So that's another way to talk about our definition. The other thing we always have to think about when we talk about this topic is what do we mean when we're recommending that parental alienation be a diagnosis in DSM-5? That seems like a simple statement, but it's actually not. The reason why is because when we say it should be in DSM-5, there are actually 3 different ways this could be. There's at least 3 different ways parental alienation could be in the diagnostic book. And what people usually think of is parental alienation should be considered a mental disorder. For those of you who are in the mental health field, you know that the whole front part of the book, the DSM-5, are mental disorders. So that's one idea. But that isn't the only thing. There's another chapter in DSM, sort of toward the back, that has a whole group of conditions that are called relational problems. And many people think that parental alienation is a really good example of a relational problem. There are already relational problems in DSM-4. For instance, there's one called sibling relational problem. That's an actual psychiatric diagnosis in DSM-4. There's another one called spouse or significant other relational problem. I kind of forget the terminology. And most relevant, there's one called parent-child relational problem. That's already in DSM. And we would think that parental alienation relational problem would be similar. I don't think it's exactly the same. And I don't particularly want parental alienation relational problem to be a subtype of parent-child relational problem, because I think they're too different, but I think it could be next to it. In other words, it could be in the same chapter. Parent-child relational problem could have its own number. Parental alienation relational problem could have its number. So you need to keep in mind that there are a number of different ways for this phrase, parental alienation, to be in DSM-5. And a third way is there's still another chapter in DSM, which is called criteria. This is an appendix, which is called Criteria, Sets, and Axes for Further Study. And that's a collection of different diagnoses that have been proposed, but where the American Psychiatric Association thinks that there's not quite enough research, or there's not enough clarity about whether that should really be considered a mental condition. And so right now in DSM-4, there's such a chapter. It has maybe 20 or 25 different proposed conditions. And so I can see that if all the big shots at DSM-5 feel that our topic isn't quite ready to be a full-fledged mental disorder, that it could be considered in this chapter called Axes for Criteria Sets for Further Study. Now, why am I belaboring this? It's because this doesn't seem to be frequently understood, that you get into a conversation and the immediate thing the other person says is, oh no, it couldn't ever be a mental disorder. But then when you explain to them what a relational problem is, they say, oh yeah, that sounds like that could be, parental alienation could fit under that general heading. So a lot of people who say they don't like this idea actually do like this other possible outcome. The other reason why you need to know this is because people in the DSM-5 task force are sometimes interviewed. They say, well, what's happening with parental alienation? In fact, there was an article in the newspaper yesterday in which one of the senior people on DSM-5 said, oh, well, it's been considered, but it's not really, it's slim. It's very slim chances that it's going to be accepted as a mental disorder. But the person who made that quote, I think, from the context of the quote, was really talking about this. He wasn't talking about this or this at all, the relational problem or the potential for further study. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding when people are quoted in the media about whether they say, oh, I want it to be in the book, or it'll never be in the book, or whatever. So anyway, we've, a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, we started this project to get parental alienation in DSM-5, and we've tried to be as public as we could be about it, and we haven't, this is not a stealth operation. We haven't kept this a secret. We've tried to let people know about it, and we've done several things. We submitted formal proposals on 2 occasions, in 2008 and 2009. These formal proposals were published in mental health journal called the American Journal of Family Therapy. So the first proposal was published in 2008, and the second proposal was published about 6 months ago in 2010. And finally, we put the proposals into a more elaborate form into this book that Dr. Billick showed you. If you want to look at it, we only have a couple of copies here today. The book only came out about a month ago, and it'll be more visible as it gets into, but it's actually on Amazon.com in case you're interested. So we've tried to get the word out. You know, what I'm trying to convey is that we're not just a little group and sitting in a room all by ourselves, that we've tried to get the word out. And also we've tried to involve many other people. In fact, in this book, I'm actually the editor of this book, and we have 70 contributing authors. And let me just show you who they are. Here are some of them, and here are some of them, and here are some of them. And these people, a number of these people are actually the speakers at this meeting today and tomorrow, and a number of other ones are here, including people from Texas and people from Finland and people from Brazil who are contributing authors who are here. So we've tried to develop this elaborate international committee to address this problem. Why are we going to all this trouble to make an international committee? Because our goal is not just DSM-5, but we're also trying to influence ICD-11, which is the document. ICD stands for the International Classification of Diseases, and that's the document that's put out by the World Health Organization. So that's why we have all these people from 12 countries. So let me explain what I'm going to be doing here for the next few minutes. Is the book is organized around the 20 reasons why parental alienation should be in DSM, or it should be a diagnosis. And we don't have time today to tell you all 20 reasons, so I'm going to go through 3 or 4 of the reasons in some detail. And basically, you know, they told me in the beginning that to be in DSM, in fact, Dr. Billick mentioned these words, validity, reliability, and prevalence, that they wanted me to be able to demonstrate the validity of the diagnosis, the reliability of making the diagnosis, and some information about what is the prevalence, meaning how often does it occur. So that's what I'm going to be explaining. That doesn't really explain the fundamental why. Let me mention by the fundamental why, I mean, why are we even doing this? Why are we going to all this trouble? I mean, I've worked on this for 2.5 years, and my other 70 people have worked on it. Why are we bothering? There's both a clinical reason and a legal reason. And I know there's some emphasis, and most of the fighting about it has to do with the legal issues. But the legal issues are not really why we started all this. The reason why we started it is a clinical issue. that as clinicians, we felt that these kids and these families need to be properly identified. I mean, if you have a situation where a child is about to lose or has already lost a relationship with one of his two parents, that's a major tragedy, that's a major problem. And we felt that clinicians should have a better understanding of what's happening and be able to identify it and therefore be able to treat it. So how is that ever going to happen? Well, for a new concept like this to be taught in graduate schools and to be in textbooks and to be in professional journals, it really, really would help for it to be officially recognized as a mental condition. So we feel that all this work to get it in DSM-5, the reason is to help clinicians know what it is and to be able to identify it, especially when it's in an early stage, because as you probably know, parental alienation can be mild, moderate, severe, and it starts out mild and it gets worse. By the time it gets too severe, it's very, very intractable. It's very, very hard to treat. So we're trying to help clinicians be more educated, and they should be taught in graduate school and medical school and in psychology graduate programs, and it should be in the book in order to make that happen. So that's the basic reason why we're going to this trouble. But now I want to go through some of the reasons as to why our evidence that it should be in DSM. So there are 20 reasons, and so here are some of them. Reason 4, the phenomenon of parental alienation was described long before parental alienation syndrome was formally defined. As you probably know, it was officially formally, that PAS was defined in 1985 by Richard Gardner. But what's really interesting is that the phenomenon was described in many, many different ways long, long before that. And there's actually a couple of historians here in New York, in fact, I think they may be here, Richard Stevens and Linda Gunsberg, who have studied this. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of things that they've turned up. That they've been interested in, was parental alienation talked about before 1985? And they've come up with many examples. Some of them are legal cases, and some of them are simply newspaper accounts of parental alienation. The reason why this is the name of this conference, by the way, Parental Alienation, Past, Present, Future. This is the past part that we're talking about right now. So here's, for instance, a legal case called Ball versus Ball that Richard Stevens found. This is from 1827. And this is just a little snippet. This is just one sentence. The father, in his answer, declared that the plaintiff had endeavored to alienate the infections of the child from him. When I read the whole article, the mother is saying that the father has alienated the children from me, and the father is saying the vice versa. So I'm not sure who actually was correct, but it is a good example of the concept of parental alienation from almost 200 years ago. And this is a sad thing. This is another example just from a newspaper. The headline says, "Child alienated, mother is suicide." And there's a little subheadline that says, "You are not my mama." Apparently what happened is divorce, high conflict. The child was visiting the father, came back from seeing the father, and said this comment, "You are not my mama," to the mother. And the mother is so distraught and devastated by that the mother killed herself. And so anyway, that was a sad, tragic situation that was in a newspaper about 100 years ago. So that's real interesting. You know, the idea is that parental alienation was not invented by Richard Gardner or somehow created by him for some malicious reason. It's been around for hundreds of years. And I want to tell you about some really interesting research. This research by a psychoanalyst named David Levy took place here in New York. This is the book that he wrote called Maternal Overprotection, but here's some information about his research. There was a child, these programs in the 1920s and 1930s, the mental health programs were called child guidance clinics. And there was a fairly famous one here in New York called the Institute for Child Guidance. And David Levy was a doctor who worked in that clinic, and he thought it would be interesting to study maternal overprotection. And he did this elaborate research. The reason why I'm telling you about this is because it's from New York. And I've given this talk a number of times, and I try to pick out something local. And so this is your local color. And so he and his students, who were social work students from Smith College, who were doing their practicum here in New York, identified, out of their 2,000 cases, they identified 20 cases of what they called maternal overprotection in its simplest and clearest form. And they were trying to study this clinical phenomenon. And these are, of course, these are intact families that they had. But what's really interesting is in reading this book, I've happened to come across this book somewhat accidentally. In reading it, he describes parental alienation, even though obviously in the 1940s he never heard of it under using that terminology. But let me give you some examples of how he describes mom, mother, father, and child. So this is David Levy's in his book, The Description of the Mother. She allows the husband to have little or no share in the baby's training. It is her baby, not his. So that's the sort of parental alienation behavior from the mother. This is the father, description of the typical father. They are readily adaptable to such complete surrender of the paternal role by virtue of their generally submissive traits. And in fact, that's been described in cases of parental alienation syndrome, where the alienated parent tends to be a little bit on the compliance side, and that's part of the reason why this happens. And then what was really interesting in the book by David Levy is his description of the child. The derogatory attitude of the child toward the father, which is in some instances fostered by the mother, thereby reducing the paternal influence to its lowest degree. So I think he's describing how in parental alienation the child actively rejects and badmouths the rejected parent. So anyway, I thought it was real interesting as a historical thing. So anyway, everything I've said so far is past, before 1985. Reason number 6 is really interesting, and it pertains to what happened in the 1980s. This is part of our justification for saying parental alienation is a valid concept, and I'll explain why. In the 1980s and 1990s, parental alienation was described independently by at least 6 researchers or groups of researchers in the United States. That's an aspect of validity. You know, in research, validity pertains in general to whether or not the concept that you're talking about actually exists. So the validity of parental alienation has to do with, is there evidence that parental alienation actually exists out there in the world, and not just in the mind of writers, people who write about it. And so this is an interesting way to show validity, which is to show that it was discovered by 6 different groups of people at about the same time, studying different populations. And you may be familiar with some of these, and let me run through them. And they're kind of in chronological order. Even before they wrote their book about divorce, Wallerstein and Kelly wrote different kinds of articles about children of divorce. And in the 1970s, they wrote an article in which they talked about pathological alignment, which I think is comparable to what other people call parental alienation. And then, of course, Richard Gardner, who worked in New York and New Jersey, is the person who came up with the name parental alienation syndrome, and his famous article was published in 1985. Now, what's really interesting is at the same time that Richard Gardner was here in New York, there was a lady in Denver, Colorado, who was a social worker named Leona Kopetsky. A lot of people have never heard of Leona Kopetsky. She's out there in Denver, and in the same period of time, she and her co-workers are doing custody evaluations for the courts in Colorado. And they write articles, and they discover the same thing. And later, eventually, when she wrote it up a few years after that, she said that her observations were similar to Gardner's conclusions regarding the characteristics of the syndrome. So that's really kind of interesting. That I don't know that Leona Kopetsky ever met Richard Gardner, but and she was not anywhere near as well known, but they were describing the same situation. So then, you may have heard of these people called Clower and Rivlin, who were sociologists. No, one was a social worker, one was a sociologist, and they were appointed by the American Bar Association to study children who rejected parents. And so they studied this in the 1970s and 1980s, and they eventually wrote this famous book called Children Held Hostage. They're coming at it from a whole different point of view from Richard Gardner, but they discover and they describe the very same thing. It's kind of interesting. There's another sociologist in California named Janet Johnston who has done a lot of research on this, and she agrees that the children that she's describing are the same children that Richard Gardner is describing. For instance, in one of her articles, she says that she discovered strong alignments related to behaviors Gardner referred to as parental alienation syndrome. And if you look at some of Johnston's articles, and if you look at the characteristics of this condition that Gardner had, that they overlap tremendously. They use almost the same words. And finally, there's a psychologist named Barry Bricklin in Pennsylvania, and he came about it from a different way. He came about it from the point of view of developing a psychological test. Bricklin has developed several psychological tests that are used in custody evaluations to figure out who does the child have a better relationship to. And so he discovered the similar kind of children. Now, why does this matter? What we're trying to, this all has to do with why should parental alienation be in the DSM? And part of our argument is that it really exists, that it's not just made up by fanatics who are trying to get children away from protective parents, that this really exists among families in this country and all over the world. And so one way to try to prove that is that it was discovered independently by different groups of people. So here's another reason that's in our book. And the basic idea is that even though there's controversy about it, it's almost universally accepted by psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and family counselors who actually evaluate these children. If you talk to psychologists who don't have anything to do with children of divorce, they sometimes are at a loss. They might not really know what this is. But if you talk to therapists who actually work with children of divorce, they see this every day. They know exactly what this is. And so I have, in the book, we have a whole series of references and citations from different people who have done this. This is kind of an interesting part, because what I just recited was how many different authors and psychologists and psychiatrists have written articles in the United States. And then we have a whole other section of our book in which we talk about how parental alienation has been described and discussed in many countries. So this was new to me. When I got involved in this 2.5 years ago, I didn't know this. But I've met people and I've talked to people in other countries. Some of them are here today. And I learned that the same thing that those 6 people we just talked about were describing in the United States have been described by dozens or maybe hundreds of writers in other countries. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a world tour and explain what some of people from other countries have said about parental alienation. In our book, we developed a big bibliography, which I think is the biggest bibliography ever created regarding parental alienation. We have about 600 references, and they come from 30 countries. These are the countries that these citations come from, and I'm going to give you a little sampling. For instance, here's Germany. Now, when I go through these different countries, there's 2 things I want you to notice. One is that there are a lot of different countries, but secondly, each country it kind of illustrates a different aspect of the problem of parental alienation. For instance, this is an article that was written by Dr. Bach-Gallo and Dr. Kojo, who are from Germany, And they're some of our authors, they're contributing authors of our book. And they're talking about the effects of parental alienation subsequently on adults when they grow up. PAS in the child can be connected with traumatizing long-term effects in the child that endure into adulthood. So that's kind of the angle that they've taken and that they've studied. So that's an example of DAS, parental alienation syndrome. This is another one of our authors, or contributing authors, whose name is Dr. Paul Ben-Susan, and his comment has to do with the fact that there are people in Europe and in other places who deny that parental alienation actually exists. They argue that it's still absent from the international classifications of psychiatric disorders. And I'm sure that comes up in legal situations where one side says, we have a problem in this family, parental alienation is happening, and the other side says, no, that's impossible because parental alienation doesn't exist because it's not in the DSM or the ICD. And Dr. Ben-Susan is commenting on that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is these different people from different countries are commenting on different aspects. Now, Dr. Ben-Susan is a interesting person. He's a forensic psychiatrist, and I think he must be the most famous forensic psychiatrist in France. And the French system of experts is different from what we do in the United States. They're appointed by the court, and Dr. Ben-Susan has been appointed by the Supreme Court of France, to help investigate cases. I don't know about parental alienation, but cases of child abuse and child sexual abuse where psychiatrists sometimes get involved. And he helped a couple of years ago investigate a very, very important case in France in which a number of people had been falsely accused of sexually abusing children. And Paul helped to sort out what actually happened. And as a result of that, he got, this is Dr. Ben-Susan with his Medal of Honor, which is kind of a special thing to get from the French government. And in this country, I've never heard of a forensic psychiatrist getting any kind of medal from the government. But there he is. Now, this is, I wanted to tell you a little bit about this organization in France that educates the public. The name of the organization you can see is called Alcalpa. But it educates the public, and this is obviously some of its educational materials, and they also educate the gendarmerie, the police, and the judicial structure in France. And I guess the reason why I'm pointing this out is I don't know that anybody here does that kind of thing. None of us have that kind of inroad into educating the legal resources in such a systematic way. I think we may do it here and there. But I just wanted to show you a couple of their PowerPoint presentation. Here, I think I have a translation here. What this says up here refers to the campaign of denigration, or what they call the campaign of defamation. But in our definition of parental alienation, the two most important things are the campaign of denigration that the child propagates against the rejected parent, and secondly, the fact that the complaints are trivial. In other words, they're absurd or trivial. The complaints that the child makes are not the kind of complaints that would make you reject a parent. And these are the first two. Those are the criteria for parental alienation, and these are the same criteria in French. In other words, this is the campaign of denigration, and then this next one is the absurd rationalizations. And so I just think and this is all put out by this organization called Alcalpa. So I just think it's kind of neat that they developed this and that they're able to use it with so many different audiences. Excuse me. So that was France. This is Italy. There's an interesting professor in Italy named Guglielmo Gulata, and I'm not going to try to read the name of his book in Italian, but his book in English is the Parental Alienation Syndrome, PAS, brainwashing and programming of children to the detriment of the other parent. Dr. Galata is a forensic psychologist, and he has engaged in what he calls the psycholinguistic analysis. And what that means is that he and his colleagues take transcripts of conversations between parents and children, and they study them very, very closely. They study the exact phrases, the sequence of terms, the sequence of comments back and forth, and they attempt to figure out what might be going on underneath of the spoken words. I guess I've given a sort of a general definition of psycholinguistic analysis. So I'm going to show you some of his slides. See, that I've gotten these from all these people, which is kind of neat. This is Professor Galata's presentation, and it says at the top up here, it says, children programmed in the forensic context by Professor Galata. And here's a little example, here's a little sample of a dialogue. And I'm going to try to read this in English. But first of all, this is a little conversation between a psychologist and a girl, a little girl. And the psychologist says, "Is your father always so bad?" In other words, I guess the girl had been describing it. And the little girl says, "No, he isn't. Sometimes he calls me sweetheart." And then she says, "Do you know why he calls me sweetheart? Because then he can go home and say, 'I tricked her. Now she believes I love her, so the judge will give me custody.'" So in other words, the father's allegedly thinking that he'll be able to get custody and the mother will cry. So this is the little girl's explanation to the psychologist. And then the psychologist says, "But do you love your father?" And the little girl says, "Yes, I do. But do you know why I love him? The devil makes me love my father." I'm not sure where that, maybe that's diagonal, I'm not sure. The devil makes me love my father, so I'll want to stay with him and my mother will be alone crying. And then the psychologist says, "How do you know that?" And the little girl says, "Well, my mom told me. I remember that my mom and I made tape recordings in order to leave him. Actually, he was already moved, but in order to not have him back." Well, here, there's one more. So, so when they write about these, and then they try to figure out, well, now what's really going on? How can we analyze this? And so what this says, there are two conclusions from this previous little analysis, and this says, if the father is good, it means that he's pretending. And if the little girl loves her father, it's because she's possessed by the devil. So I have a couple of points about this. One is that this is very interesting. I mean, these are people who have dissected the conversations between children and parents to try to figure out and to try to document how the alienation comes about. So that's interesting. The other thing that's interesting is people in this country don't know anything about this research. People at the APA who are in the task force for the DSM-5, I'm sure have never heard of this kind of research. And it's really important, in my mind, to point out to them that there's dozens of these studies that on different aspects of parental alienation all over the world that they need to know about. So, this is Spain. These are actually a couple of other of our authors, this Dr. Jarnet and Dr. Arch Marin. And just what they're saying here is actually that they're proposing that parental alienation be considered a relational problem. I said that in the beginning, that a lot of people think it should be a relational problem rather than a mental disorder. Both are diagnoses, both are in the book. But here are a couple of psychologists in Spain who wrote an article about that, coincidentally published in 2009. They were in Spain writing about this at the very same time we were here writing the very same thing, and we didn't know about each other, but we eventually discovered each other. So anyway, that's an example from Spain. I want to say something about the Czech Republic, and especially about Dr. Bakalar. this Edward Bakalar was doing custody evaluations in Prague when? In the 1960s. And he discovered, more or less on his own, the phenomenon of parental alienation. And then he later read Richard Gardner and other people, and that helped him understand what was going on. People take different angles towards this. Bakalar, in this particular thing, is trying to explain, kind of in a psychodynamic way, what's happening. And so he's saying neurotic, egotistical projection on the part of at least one parent can cause the child to favor a point of view and take sides when the child observes parental conflict, and so on. So that's an interesting way of trying to explain what's happening in parental alienation. Dr. Bakalar is an interesting guy. I'm sad to say he's deceased. He died a few months ago. But I'm about to show you his other interest. Dr. Bakalar was interested in puzzles. And I'm trying to introduce you to these different people from other countries. And this is a puzzle that he created. And apparently all these pieces here are supposed to somehow fit into this dodecahedron up here. And I have no idea how that happens. But anyway, that's something about the Czech Republic. So let me tell you something about Brazil. Brazil is somewhat unusual. We have one of our, I keep commenting on our contributing authors, and we have one from Brazil who's here today, I think. But there's a judge in Brazil who's written about this. So it's a little bit unusual to have a judge. This judge, Maria Bernice Diaz, was very activist as a judge, and then I think she was an appellate judge, and now I think she's retired. But she has a website, and she wrote about all sorts of things about the law in Brazil. And so parental alienation was one of the things she was interested in. And she talks about how the father and the child, their love is interrupted. And this generates feelings of conflict and destruction of the bond. In this game of manipulation, all weapons are used, including the assertion of having been the victim of child sexual abuse. So I'm sure that's familiar to many of you, and that in this kind of situation, sometimes one parent accuses the other of child sexual abuse. And here's a judge in Brazil who's describing that. The other thing that's interesting about Brazil, I bet most of you don't know this, but the government in Brazil recently made it a crime to commit parental alienation. That there was a group of people there who worked on this for a long time, and it was passed by the legislature, and about a month ago it was signed by the president of Brazil. And what this says is the presidency of the republic, and this is the number of the law, and this says the President of the Republic makes it known that the National Congress has passed and that he enacts the following law. And then this says, this law rules on parental alienation. And this gives a little definition of parental alienation, which is approximately the same as the definition that I told you in the very beginning of this talk. So that's really interesting. Here's a country that has actually made it a crime that's punishable. And they even, the law instructs the judges on the different ways that they can remedy the situation when parental alienation is identified. Here's something from Australia, which we don't need to spend time on, except she's just saying that it's a problem. Here's something from South Africa that's interesting, and what's interesting about that is that what this psychologist is saying there is he's saying the same thing that we all already know, that the longer the time spent with the alienating parent, the more likely the process of alienation will be consolidated. It is suggested that PAS be recognized as a form of child abuse, and that Therefore, custody may be awarded to the innocent party with sanctions potentially applied against the alienating party. So that's unlike Brazil. This is not an official government proclamation, but this is a point of view of a psychologist in South Africa. One of our authors is Ludwig Lowenstein, who's a fellow in England, who's a psychologist who has written lots of articles and a book about parental alienation. And he introduced this term of implacable hatred. So for instance, he says here, the inducer of the implacable hatred holds the key to the child's delusional beliefs, and so on. Same thing in Canada. There are some people in Canada, a number of people. Barbara Fiedler is a psychologist, and she and her colleagues are did a book about this topic. Let me just end here with these countries, with the United States. There was a child psychiatrist a few years ago named Frank Williams, and he uses the term parentectomy. I don't know if he was the first person to ever use that term, but he talks about parentectomy. And he says, in part of this quotation, a parentectomy is the most cruel infringement upon children's rights to be carried out against human children by human adults. Parentectomies are psychologically lethal. So that's a pretty potent quotation, and I think that most of us would agree with that. So I've tried to go through some of these reasons. I'm going to go through another reason. Most of what I've said has to do with validity. Validity means, does the thing really exist in real life? And my point is that all these things, hundreds of things have been written all over the world, prove to me, and it should prove to the DSM, that it really exists. So there's another question about reliability. Reliability is whether, inter-rater reliability is whether different groups of professionals observing the same child would come up with the same answer. And test-retest reliability is whether the same professional later would come up with the same answer. So there's been some research on this. Carlos Rueda did this a few years ago, and Stephen Morrison, who's sitting here in the audience, replicated this. And basically it involved showing or having vignettes presented to professionals, and then the professionals were asked, is this parental alienation or isn't it? And if it is it mild, moderate, or severe? And then they were asked about different features, different symptoms, as to whether or not they were present. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but these are two different studies, and the second one pretty much replicated the first one. And this is a way of measuring correlation coefficient, and these are fairly good correlation coefficient numbers. So this isn't definitive. This kind of research needs to be done much more, in more elaborate ways with more people. This had 14 experts and 31 experts. But this is the kind of thing that means that there has been some serious study about parental alienation in an objective way. They also did what's called test-retest reliability. And so and this is where the vignettes are rated, and then 60 days later they're rated again by the same people. And generally, in these two studies, the vast majority of the ratings were the same the second time around as the first time. So that's an example of reliability research. Now, when I was first started this, I was told I need to have information about validity, reliability, and prevalence. So I tried to figure out what is the prevalence of parental alienation in the United States. Nobody has that number, nobody has that answer. But I did come up with a very, very rough way of estimating it. Prevalence means of all the children and adolescents right now, today, what percentage of them today have parental alienation? So, we estimated 1%, and I'm going to show you how we arrived at that. I got to tell you, this is a rough way of figuring out prevalence, but it is a very rough number. Some of this we know. the census people here in the United States tell us that 20% of children in this country live with separated or divorced parents. So that figure is actually pretty definite. And then if you take all the families that are divorced, what percentage of those would be considered high conflict divorce or even medium conflict divorce? So there's some research that shows that about 20% of divorces involve conflict over the children. Then, if there's conflict over the children, what percentage of those involve kids who actually develop parental alienation? And so there's a number of people who have tried to figure that out, and there's a range of answers to that question, but sort of 25% is about in the middle. And that includes all degrees, in other words, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe parental alienation. So if you multiply this times this times this, you get 20% times 20% times 25%, you get 1% of children and adolescents in this country. That's a very rough figure, but it is, I think it's a useful figure to think about, because that's hundreds of thousands of kids in this country to be concerned about. I've gone through some of the reasons, of the 20 reasons why parental alienation should be a diagnosis. So we've gone through some of them. And so people usually ask me, well, what is the status of this? Has DSM decided, or will they decide, or so I got to tell you, they don't give me very much feedback. I do have a contact person at DSM-5, one of the senior people, and he gives me informal feedback, but I have not gotten any, nobody's written me a letter saying this is what we have decided. But as I said before, there are actually 3 different topics. One is whether it should be considered a mental disorder. Now, I have gotten informal feedback that they don't like that idea. They don't want one more mental disorder. And the threshold for becoming a mental disorder is very high, that you have to have lots of research about validity, reliability, and prevalence. So I don't know that that's going to happen. But as far as I can tell, whether it should be considered a relational problem hasn't even been considered. That hasn't even been discussed. That this topic has yet to even been addressed by the committee that is part of the DSM-5 task force. And whether it should be in the criteria sets for further study, as far as I know, that has not even been addressed. And in fact, I received a note the other day from the fellow, my contact person, and he said, I said, well, give me an update, what's going on with this? And he said that all 3 of these are still undergoing discussion. That's under ongoing discussion, I think was the term. Now, the discourse about this topic in this country has not always been pleasant. There are people who are somewhat, maybe, I guess, unprofessional in the way they deal with this topic on the internet. And I'll give you a little example. A few months ago, the APA published a draft for what's going to be in DSM-5, and they published this on their website. And it was a big announcement about all this. And so this was a picture that showed up on one of these internet websites saying the APA released its proposed draft. Where is parental alienation syndrome? They said it was going to be there. Sorry, whores, your money train just left the station. Where is PAS? Not anywhere there. This is sort of maybe a teeny bit immature way to have a professional conversation. But the people who did this didn't realize that it actually was there. In other words, when the APA posted their draft, they had a section in which they said there are other things that are still being considered, conditions proposed by outside sources. And these are still being considered, and it says, we welcome your comments on whether evidence indicates they should be in DSM-5, and parental alienation was one of the things on this list. And I think we're in good company. I mean, fetal alcohol syndrome is also on this list. And frankly, I mean, I don't know anybody who doesn't think that fetal alcohol syndrome is a serious disorder. So that's what we've been trying to do. As far as I can tell, this is still being addressed. According to this quotation yesterday in the newspaper by another senior person at DSM-5, the task force has received mountains of communications, input from the general public and professionals about this topic, more on this topic than any other aspect of DSM-5. And that's how you can help. If you're interested in this, they're still taking comments. And we can give you, it's actually in the book, in the back part of the book, it actually gives the names and addresses of who you can contact if you're interested, if you want to. There are people at the DSM-5 office in Washington, D.C., and then there are people in the ICD-11 office in Geneva. And if you have strong feelings about this, you're welcome to send them a letter and tell them what you think. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy all of today and tomorrow at this really wonderful conference.